Welcome to the Data Leadership Lessons Podcast. I'm your host, Anthony J. Algman. Data is everywhere in our businesses, and it takes leadership to make the most of it. We bring you the people, stories, and lessons to help you become a data leader. Today, I'm joined by Barbara Nichols. Barbara is an accomplished information technology professional with over 35 years of experience assisting clients and software vendors to develop data-driven solutions. She founded MetaView 360 in 2002 and consults in the areas of data governance, integration, metadata management, and data architecture. Barbara, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's very nice to be here, Anthony.
So why don't we start off, why don't you take a moment and give our audience a little bit more background on yourself and how you formed this organization back in 2002. So you're pushing 20 years in business and kind of how data has been this consistent thread throughout your career.
Yeah, it's funny. Back when I started my career in the Jurassic period, I started out as a programmer and business analyst, and then managed a group of programmers. And I remember looking at a system where they told me I needed to, figure out all these places. What did all this data mean from the COBOL file structures? And I started looking, and my gosh, there was in this order management system, ship date, preferred ship date, required ship date, last ship date, future ship date, and I just said, oh my God, this is horrible. I would never do this for a living. And then I kind of got bitten by the data bug. I was managing a group of folks, and we were building a new export system for Digital Equipment Corporation. So you had to go through a licensing process. This was back in the Cold War. So you had to go through a licensing process to get things shipped. And there were certain places you were not allowed to ship things. Like Vaxes could not be shipped behind the Iron Curtain because of the processing capabilities they had.
Right.
And a couple of the guys on my team and we took a course, and it was called Data Analysis for Database Design. Okay. And basically, it was teaching you how to model data so that if you got the data modeled correctly, the only code you really needed to write was create, retrieve, update, delete, because all of the linkages between the data specified how everything was related to each other. So we did this. We built a data model for the export department. We built a process model to go with it that linked with the data model, and we built a system that really stood the test of time. When digital was running out of order numbers at one point, and they would go around and they would say, well, how long is it going to take you to update the order number, which was called like the DEC number or the DEC_NO or digital £, or 15 other flavors of ways that people had named it. And it cost the company, like in 1976 dollars, like $2 million and 2 years to implement that change. And after we built this system, the next thing that needed to be expanded was the part number. And that was a pretty complicated number. And everybody else was saying 2 years. And I said, well, it'll probably take us about 3 months. And they said, why are you saying 3 months? And everybody else is saying 2 years. I said, well, we have a database. We basically have to expand the field, recompile all of our programs, and they will simply run. That's all we're going to need to do. And if I could do it, without having anything else to do, we could probably do it in about 3 weeks, but I'm inserting other work. So I think 3 months. And that was when the data management program at Digital was really founded. And I was asked to be one of the founders of that. And we brought data governance, data modeling, training, everything, organizational structure to Digital Equipment Corporation, which was, I think, had about 200,000 employees at that point and didn't have a single data standard. Wow. Not one. So it was a big job, and we put the whole infrastructure together, and that sort of is the foundation of where I learned, how to do it. And I owe my thanks to the export department, I guess. I had to learn a lot about it.
How much like forward visibility did you have when you were on that path? Like when you started out on that journey to start to become better with data in a big organization, did you know where you were heading, or were you kind of just figuring it out as you go along?
Oh no, we were figuring it out as we were going along. There was one woman in the organization. She worked in an architectural capacity, and she knew how to model data. I think she was the only other person who had ever done it. I kept taking our data model to her and going, "Now, is this right? Is this right?" And she'd go, "Yeah, that looks good." And I go, "Okay," but I would go back and check with her because I wasn't convinced this was going to really work, but it did, and we had lasting success. And at one point, the technology architects were called in because we needed to be able to ramp the system up to do like 4 times as much as we were doing before. And they came in, they thinking, "Oh, well, we'll fix what these people have built." And they came away and they said, "No, they actually did it right. And it'll handle the volume. And they've optimized all the transactions and separated data capture from data access. And it just works." So that was very validating.
So I'm maybe projecting, but because I assume based on that comment, you're not super deep technical, but you obviously have data modeling and some technical backbone and understand how databases work. Where would you say, especially at that time in your career, you fell on that technology versus business continuum? Like whereabouts were you at that point? And have you moved since then, or do you still kind of orient in that fashion?
Well, it's back then. I mean, I knew how to program in the languages that we were using then, but I realized I was probably never going to be the best programmer in the world. I didn't actually like it once I had figured out the problem. Then you had to code it. What a waste, So I really got turned on by the data, because by getting the model right, you built a huge lever for doing a lot of work. And that really appealed to me. So I would say my background makes it really, I can talk to technical people. I understand what they're doing. I understand their pressures. I understand what can be done. And I understand it from a structure point of view, from the underlying data structure. And over the years, I think I've kind of pretty much kept that. I mean, I worked for Essential Software before it was built by IBM. And there were 5 of us who created a patented technology that allowed disparate tools to talk to each other as though they'd been built together. And it was very technical. I wasn't coding any of it. You'd never want me to do that. But working on explaining it to the whole sales force, showing them how to sell it, building the demos, giving them the ammunition they needed to go out into the field and sell the product was sort of where I was, as well as linking up to the engineers as I was testing their product. They'd say, "Here, try this," and I'd break it in 5 minutes, and we'd go back and forth. So I'm probably kind of in the middle, but I don't code.
Yeah, well, but you have, and I think you and I have somewhat similar backgrounds in that we have some technical backgrounds. Like we know how to program, we know some of those basics, and I know there's plenty of people out there that are successful in their data careers that have no technology background whatsoever. But I still advocate that we should all have at least some sort of technology boot camp, like at least learn some Python programming, or at least learn, like if you're a data person and you can't write SQL, learn SQL, like at least learn some of that, because it teaches you not just about the technology itself, but it helps you create more structure to the way you solve problems. And I think, and I loved your answer about how you've been kind of oriented towards data for a long time, and that sits somewhere in the middle. And I agree with that. I laughed when you said, like, you figured out how to make it work, and then you had to go build the whole thing on the programming side, and that isn't as much fun. And I agree with you on that. Like, I have the same perspective, but that's where data is so interesting, because it is such a core piece of that problem solving part of both business and technology. I think if you really enjoy solving problems, really enjoy trying to make things work from a logical perspective, not just a physical perspective. Like when I did some web development work, I just was mind-numbingly bored with all the click events and all this stuff that I had to code for. It's like, that was not for me. But when I tried to figure out, okay, what does a website need to capture in terms of data that then can be useful for the people that are interacting with that website, that was a lot more interesting to me. So I think you're really onto something about why there's a certain kind of personality type or certain persona that you have when you really gravitate towards data. Because you got a bunch of data people, we'll have a wonderful conversation about how interesting data is or what have you. But if you get a non-data person in that group, it's like me at an insurance dinner. I just have no interest in the topic at hand. So
I think it's really helpful. I really appreciate what the technologists have to go through, because I know what a database will and won't do. I know there isn't any magic, that it all has to, it's all zeros and ones, when you get right down to it. And that was my very first job, is, working with assembler language. So, it's all, I really appreciate what they have to go through to make what you've modeled real, especially if there's a system that already exists, because you can't just slam this stuff in there. It's going to need to be done in a thoughtful way so that other things don't break. And I think it can happen on the business side too. One of the things I liked about data is that it's science and art. It's mathematically, the foundation is predicate calculus, but then you throw human beings into it and all the semantics that they bring. And then the English language, which has unbelievable anomalies, that, are literal, are shades of meaning, whatever. And so what's hard is being able to do both, understanding the technology and the mathematics behind it. One of my favorite sayings, and it was from Watts Humphrey, was all models are wrong because they're models, but good ones are useful.
That's right.
So you have to understand how it gets put together so that it works. And the business needs to understand that they've been doing certain things that are going to make it very difficult to implement something on the other side. And that's where I sort of sit.
Yeah. So it makes me think too, one of my favorite quotes is it's not rocket science. Controlled explosions are a lot more predictable than people. I think
this is true.
So, but I want to walk back a comment I made just moments ago in terms of the insurance being interesting. I actually find insurance very interesting from a data perspective, but I made the comment because I have a lot of friends in the insurance space, and when they get together in their community of insurance people, it's another level that I just don't get. And so that was my comment. No offense to the insurance folks out there. I want to make sure they understand where I'm coming from there. But I find insurance normal interesting, not insurance as my life interesting. Anyway, I want to talk a little bit about, so we understand kind of where you're coming from and your perspective. You have a business that you've had for 18 plus years now, and doing consulting, doing a lot of work in the data management space. Can you talk a little bit about how that business came into being and how you've how you've been successful for so long? That's such a great achievement.
Well, I think in the beginning, I sort of had a built-in base. When I left Essential Software, I got laid off there. Been a series. Digital was going out of business. They were laying off a lot of people. And then we formed our own company for a little while. 7 of us built the product that we had created, the model that would integrate other models. And then we as a team went to work for Essential Software. They bought the company. And when I left there, I had trained all the salespeople how to sell the metadatabase that they had that sat underneath their ETL product. I had taught all the sales engineers how to do proof of concepts, how to make the products sing and dance with each other. And so when they would sell, and on top of that, the services organization did not want to have anything to do with the metadata aspect of the product suite. They just made their living with the ETL stuff. They knew it worked. They were happy. This was a new product. It had its pieces that weren't as smooth as they should have been. Sure. And they like to code. People who really get into metadata and data management, if you really love to code, that's probably not going to be a panacea for you.
True. Because
we model the data so that you don't have to write so much code. Yeah. So anyway, I left Essential and I said, well, I'll take a couple months off. And then I think the next job I have, if I get laid off again, I'm going to lay myself off. And I got a call from one of the field people saying, look, this customer really needs help, la, 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 la. Will you come out and help them? And I spent 2 weeks out in California helping this customer get the metadata infrastructure put in place, had the ETL tool working with it, so they got what they were looking for, some data lineage that they needed. And it was great. I loved it. I could go in, I could really make a difference. I didn't have to come back to 150 email messages that I had gotten during the day. And so I said, I'm going to just do this. And so the sales folks and the sales engineers, all the people that I had trained, they said, oh, you want to implement the metadata portion? Oh, you need to call Barbara Nichols. Ah. And so that first year and a half of my business easily was based upon referrals in that way. So that was really a good thing.
That's great.
And yeah, and then, expanded from there. A lot of times it was connected to the ETL tool. They wanted the metadata tool, but sometimes it wasn't. Sometimes, and I view myself as being sort of tool agnostic, but tool aware. I need to know how they work in order to be able to make recommendations about what tool is going to make their lives the most easy and give them the benefit they're looking for. So I need to know about them, but that's really helpful, but especially when you're trying to integrate things.
Yeah. So I feel like now there's metadata everywhere in all of these technology tools, and there's metadata platform tools and metadata add-ons to data stack tools and all of these things. Like, it feels like at this point there's so many tools. Shouldn't we have an answer by now? Like, shouldn't this be an easy thing to do? Why hasn't tools? Why haven't tools solved this for us yet?
Yeah, I think back even in the 70s when I was working, people have always been searching for the silver bullet, and I remember when it was going to be artificial intelligence, back in the early 80s, that was going to solve all the world's problems.
Right.
And it didn't, of course. And then object orientation. Oh my God, that was going to solve all the world's problems. You didn't have to do any designs. You did it object oriented and you'd be in good shape. And that didn't quite work out as well as some people hoped it would. And when you get right down to it, there's different slices of these things. You can talk about object orientation from a programming perspective and from a data perspective. Mm-hmm. And it's very powerful in a data perspective. I like modeling data that combines entity relationship modeling with the ability to do subtypes and inheriting of attributes, from the super types above. I think it's a great way to do data modeling. It's a bit of a hybrid approach, but most of the tools, do that now, the data modeling tools.
Right.
But they all are solving a particular problem. And nobody is going, completely end to end. And people want to buy products that they like, and they want them to work together. Mm-hmm. So I think what's missing is, you have a set of blocks, and you're building something, but there are a couple of pieces missing. So a lot of times it's how do you orchestrate the tools to work together so that you get, as a byproduct of simply doing your work, you get something like data lineage, that you can go from this column on this report came from this ETL job, which came from that ETL job, which came from that ETL job, back to a business glossary and a data model upon which it started. And this is huge for companies, especially like in the banking business with the Basel II banking accords. If you can demonstrate that you have control of your data to that degree, you don't have to keep as much money in reserve for making loans. This is huge. This saves them a tremendous amount of money. So the data lineage, it's not just technical. Mm-hmm. It can be dealt with in a technical way with tools. But when you want to add tools, like I want my BI tool to be able to talk to my metadatabase. I want my ETL tool to talk to my metadatabase. Mm-hmm. How do they need to talk so that the metadata seamlessly can be connected, between the tools that I'm using?
Yeah, that's a great point. And it's where does the responsibility for data lineage lie? Because it's when you're like consuming data kind of at the end of that life cycle where you say, okay, finally all this data has come to me. I want to know what was that journey like. Then you're stuck with trying to go back and figure it all out. And that's not the right way to do that. Like it's really hard. And I know, I'm sure you've had to go down that path. How do you unwind that? Because that's a tight knot. That is, especially in large organizations. It's tricky to unwind. How do you start to address a big problem like that?
Well, I think you have to look at, what do you need to know? Do you need to be able to go from the column on the report, all the way back to the business glossary? And what happened to this data on its trip from its source to the column on this report that I'm looking at right now?
Right.
That is typically what's looked for. So you can, go back from the BI tool and the ETL tool if they're both using a repository that allows these things to be connected under the covers. That's where those linkages get maintained. Mm-hmm. In some ETL tools, you have to do things a certain way. There's some ETL tools where you can build a perfectly running ETL job that never uses the metadata layer underneath. Whereas changing people to say, no, you have to get the metadata for this database from the repository, not from gluing yourself to the actual database and just sucking it in, because it was put there by the data modeling tool. So it has what the data description is. It has all kinds of stuff. You might be able to navigate to what's the quality of this data. I got it from this source. Is this a source that would get an A+ or a C+? And how much should I depend upon the quality of this data in order to make some big business decisions?
Sure. And I'd like to think like the more we can pass lineage information as a handoff as part of the ETL process, the better it gets downstream. And that's great. When we find ourselves in a situation where we don't have the insights that we want from a data lineage perspective. And a lot of times this effort gets triggered from a CEO or a CFO saying, why aren't these two numbers the same? Exactly. They should be the same. Why aren't they the same? And then that somebody like us has to go and figure that out. But the more we ask upstream systems to share information differently, now we're starting to influence, ultimately we start to influence like operational systems and ask them to do things, which can be a cardinal sin in some organizations. Where like, no, you can't touch operations. So you think in a big company, how many people get involved at all those different steps? How many different groups are have interests? How many different systems you may not even have an ability to change or touch or whatever? Like the complexities of moving beyond like our here's what we would like to do, but when you actually go and deal with the need to make that happen later, once the systems have already been put in place, it's a much more difficult challenge. And so I think, one easy lesson for anybody who's listening is if you're building something new, do this, like pass the lineage information along, like find a way to start to percolate that better, because now is your best chance.
Yeah. And I know, I think that is part of it. The key to why it often doesn't happen. Sometimes people don't realize they're providing metadata that they don't necessarily need, but the next tool down the line needs it.
Right.
So you have to provide things that may not be, in necessarily your best interest at that moment or something you need to do. But if you don't do it that way, going from, the column on this report back to where this came from, the link is broken, the bridge is out.
Yeah.
So if they don't provide things in a particular way, you do a disservice down the line. And when you bring up the point about things, why are these two numbers different? What I've seen happen a lot of times is that it may not be the technology that's doing it. You go all the way back to the semantics. And someone says, well, I want to know what net profit is when we sell this thing, but nowhere is net profit defined in a single clear way. So you have 5 source systems and they've defined net profit, differently from each other. And they think they're communicating because it's the same words, but the formula underneath is different. And that's really hard to dig out and to fix a lot of times.
Well, in your talk here, you've brought up a couple scenarios where this is why data policies and data governance exists, because if left to their own devices, they're going to do things that are not as beneficial to the overall system as we need them to be. And so saying things like, hey, you need to provide lineage information, or hey, this is the clear definition of how we make this term work in our organization. Those are things that can't be done in that fragment, in that silo, with the best benefit of everyone. That's why you need that coordination. That's why you need those policies.
Exactly. And that's, where the data governance comes in, and jobs like data stewardship and, data controllers. Usually it's hard to wrest some of that, get some of that authority out of the hands of the technical people and get the business people to realize that, guess what? You own the definition of this stuff. Some people, some businesses say, oh no, the data, well, that's all IT. And it's not. What the data means is the business's responsibility.
Right.
And, you see data anomalies all the time. I told a story once that is funny about Mass Hampshire.
Yeah.
I was looking at a data model for an HR part of a business. And this was about digital, and I can say it now because digital doesn't exist anymore. And I'm looking down the list of valid state codes, and I see MH. And I said, what's MH? And they said, oh, that's Mass Hampshire. And I said, do tell, what's Mass Hampshire? And can Massachusetts be far behind? And so they explained to me that when the payroll system was started, you had one address associated with an employee. You were a small company. This is the way it worked. Well, they didn't envision that at some point you might have employees that live in one state but get paid out of working in another state. For example, in Massachusetts, you must take out sales tax and all the taxes that Massachusetts has. In New Hampshire, they don't have the same taxes.
Mm.
They don't have, the same sales taxes and income taxes and property taxes. So they would pay people out of where they worked.
Mm.
But even if you worked in New Hampshire, if you happened to live in Massachusetts, you still had to take out Massachusetts taxes.
Oh.
So they invented a new state called Mass Hampshire, which meant you work out of Nashua, New Hampshire, but you live in XYZ, Massachusetts. And I said, geez, guys, when you have to start making up states that the USPS doesn't know about, this is a clue that there is something missing in your data model. And you had one address associated, with a person. A person could live at one address, work at another address. But because they didn't want to touch the payroll system because it was probably totally undocumented and it just worked. Mm-hmm. So they didn't want to make any changes there. So they invented some states. But we had we had very early what I would call data warehousing at Digital. There was a system we had where it separated data transactions from the analytic data. And in the middle, there was a standards filter. So data had to pass through the standards filter to get to the warehouse. Mm. And it's very similar. This was before ETL tools existed, but that's what we did. So Mass Hampshire, when you saw Mass Hampshire coming through, in order to do the translation correctly, you created those two relationships on the data access side, because the last thing you want to have happen is some executive get a report that says, 795 people live in Mass Hampshire. You're going, what? That's not a great thing. So, the technical people sometimes with old systems especially had to do certain things like that because they couldn't change the underlying data structure or were too afraid to. But you don't want it showing up on executive reports, and you need a standard way to pull it apart and put it the way it should be if it had been able to be modeled correctly in the beginning.
Yeah. Well, and it's one of those examples.
There are lots of those.
I love that story.
So many. Oh my God, there's so many. It's funny.
Yeah. It shows, the importance of realizing that sometimes, they didn't mean to create a huge mess by inventing a state called Mass Hampshire. They were reasonably
you see that progression. Problem.
Yeah, it's
they're
not
solving a problem.
Yeah, it was a well-intended solution that had unintended consequences, and I think we can all think of it. But I just and I love that story for multiple reasons, not least of which is that it's going to give me the best title for an episode on this podcast.
From Mass Hampshire to Rotachusetts.
Welcome to Mass Hampshire, and something like that. So we'll see where it ends up. But
It was funny. I was telling a couple of my colleagues who worked for an insurance company. We had worked together at DEC, and I said, "Oh God, you remember Mass Hampshire? We had how many states are there? 50 states. We had 54 states," and they didn't laugh. And I said, "What's the matter?" And she said, "We have 76 state codes."
Oh no!
I went, oh no! So there was a lot that went around. They built a whole other country with their states. So I don't know why, but they had reasons.
Wow. Yeah, well, and I think if you dig enough in any organization that's been around for a while with different systems and different consequences, you see these artifacts that are crazy. And the danger, too, is that, this one's funny because it was commonly used. You had an answer in front of you. But how many things can you think about that you've encountered by looking at the data and nobody knows? That business knowledge has left long ago. And you just have to try to figure out what to do about it. Right.
There was another one that I loved where, it's totally business semantics, in that this one company I was working with, they were having a horrible problem coming up with a set of standard industrial classifications. And I thought, Well, that seems silly because there are published ones. So, what's the segmentation codes? What's the problem? And so I talked with them. We were on a conference call. And after about 10 minutes, I had to stop and I said, "You're trying to build market segmentation codes." And they said, "Yes." And I said, "I need to ask you what your definition of market is. Because for most companies, the market is something that's out there and you're trying to secure a piece of it." And they said, "Oh, no, that's not what it means here." And I said, "What does it mean here?" "It's the group inside the company that services that client." And I said, "Well, no wonder you can't come up with one set of codes. You're addressing two different things." Again, like the states, they were missing a relationship. There was a standard industrial classification, a SIC code for a company that doesn't change. You can purchase the set, from Dun and Bradstreet.
Right.
It doesn't change unless the company changes its business. But who services them inside your company? That's a completely different thing.
Right.
They had a not-for-profit hospital with a segmentation code of profit because a particular area of the business serviced that client. So they're reporting inaccurately on what they're doing. And I said, you have two different things here. And they went, "Oh, yeah, well, go tell that to management." I said, "Wait a minute. You're the data governance committee. I would have no trouble going into your CEO of this very large corporation and explaining this issue. And I bet she would say, 'Fix it, make it so.'"
Right.
If you don't have the authority to do that as the data governance people, who does? This is what you are supposed to be bringing up, but sometimes people who come from the technical side, I think they think, "No, we have to do this workaround because technically, the CEO isn't going to understand my problem." They'll understand the business problem. They'll understand if they're getting bad data. They'll understand if their reports aren't working or they're getting two different answers for the same thing.
Yeah.
That has traction.
It's I think there's a pattern there too, where people that have become advocates for things like data governance, we have we deal at that most granular level, at the lowest level, with all of the data. That's how data gets recorded, is at the lowest level. And I think there's often that fear of raising issues too high, or feeling like these things aren't at the level of the executive team or what have you. But what you realize is that as we gain more experience in our careers, these are strategic issues. These are business limiting factors that do raise the eyebrow of executives. I mean, like we talked about earlier, that CEO is going to say, "Hey, these two numbers don't match. Why don't they match?" The leadership does care about data and uses data. They may be using it in aggregate, but that aggregate still relies on the quality of the underlying granular form.
Absolutely. I've often, looked at data in the most granular form, like the periodic table of elements. And as you combine those elements into molecules, that's where you're getting the information that shows up on the reports. But if everybody has a slightly different periodic table of contents for data, it's a mess. It's a mess. And your data model, the consistency of what's in the data model, that's where you record your standard answers. And that becomes your business glossary that ties to your data catalog, because data lineage is important, but so is where used analysis. So I have this thing in my data catalog called, Social Security number. And there's a definition for it. And guess what? The government, let's pretend, said, "We're going to make the Social Security number longer. We're going to add another 4 digits to it." Now you have to find every place that is implemented in all of your data structures, old crusty files, databases, tables, you name it. And you have to find all of that and make the changes. So where used impact analysis is really like that flip side of data lineage. Data lineage is sort of like ancestry.com, for what you're looking at on your reports and things. But it's just as important to know, oh my God, this change is happening, sort of like the deck number at Digital when they were running out of orders. Where are all the places I need to go to make that change so nothing breaks? It's really important.
That is. And so we're about out of time.
Okay.
We've covered a lot of ground today, and it's been a pleasure talking to you. I hope we can have you back again. I feel like we could make this a regular appearance on the show, because I love your stories and the way to bring it together. I feel like for some of the folks listening, this may be a bit overwhelming. Like there's a lot of different directions and challenges and every I always joke, like every stone you unturned, it's worse than you were hoping, and there's also 100 more stones. And
that
so
can
it's
happen. That's true.
Where do they start? Like in the last minute or two we have, like where should people start when they just know, hey, we've got problems and we're struggling? How do you get going when you work with an organization?
Well, I think when you have your data governance, committee, or the VP or whoever is sponsoring the whole data program, which you do need. If you don't have that, you're not going to get very far. But I think you have to prioritize the business problems. Every instance of a data problem might not be felt at the highest levels of the business. Pick something that matters. Pick something to fix that matters, and document how you did it, and start from there. And maybe it's solving one of those data lineage issues. Maybe it's finding out that net profit has 14 different definitions and singling in on one of them and making the changes, or transforming the data so that the same definition is coming out the other side. I think you have to pick something that's going to have business impact, and where you can show, here's what we did, and by solving this problem, we either save the company this amount of money, or you can make better decisions, which means you don't put your next building in the wrong place, or something like that. Those are really, you bet your business decisions. So pick something that's relevant and solve a problem, and you'll have people that love you forever, I think.
Yeah, Barbara, that's awesome advice. And thank you so much for being on the show today. This has been a lot of fun.
Oh, I've enjoyed it a lot. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you for watching or listening today. You'll find links and more information about today's topic in the show notes. Subscribe to our show on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts. Visit Algman.com to learn more about Algman Data Leadership and the many ways we can help you become a data leader. Stay safe during these unusual times, and go make an impact.